Hi, welcome. We are doing a town hall meeting this evening talking about the residential tenant landlord ordinance that just passed and became effective June 1st here in Cook County, in suburban Cook County. It's very much like the Chicago tenants' rights ordinance, but applies to all the suburbs except those with their own ordinances. And we're here with Scott Britton, who represents the 14th district in the Cook County Board, and Kevin Morrison, who represents the 15th Cook County District. A little bit on this ordinance. It was first introduced in summer of 2020. That's when kind of the process started to put that together. It was actually introduced in, January 2020. It was, the process started July 2020. It was introduced into the county board, and it passed in January 2021. We just had a little pandemic there in the middle of all that we had to deal with. So, and with that, I'm going to start asking some questions of the two commissioners so they can help explain what this ordinance is and what it does, which is kind of the big question. How does this actually apply to me? So, to Commissioner Britton, can you give us an overview of what the residential tenant landlord ordinance, and I'm going to use a shortcut and say RTLO for some of these questions, but that's what it is. What do tenants really need to know about this?
So Tom, the first thing I'd recommend is that anybody, and the easy thing to do, and maybe we can even post this in the chat, but you can easily find a summary by just searching RTLO, Cook County, on a Google search or wherever you want to search your internet stuff, and it pops up with a really good page that the county's put together that not only provides a summary, it also provides phone numbers for legal aid groups and places you can get help if you can't figure it out. But just generally, I can tell you that it's designed to make sure that any renter in suburban Cook County has a habitable rental property. And that means a lot of different things. There are a lot of requirements. It's an over 30-page document, but it basically says there's certain things that landlords can do, landlords can't do. There are limits to move-in fees, late fees, security deposits. There's lots of things in there that are designed to prevent renters from being egregiously overcharged or taken advantage of in multiple different ways. And so, if something's broken, there's a mechanism that it gets it fixed. There's lots of different things that really, I think, can be a benefit to our suburban renters who've been waiting since 1986 to have this in the suburbs.
Yeah, 1986 being when the
Chicago ordinance passed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Morrison, when did the anti-lockout, talk to me about the anti-lockout provision?
And so that was the portion of this ordinance that went to immediate effect upon passage, I believe January 28th, at that board meeting. Now, the anti-lockout provision, now, first perspective for all of you out there, only Chicago, Mount Prospect, and Evanston had RTLOs or similar policies in effect prior to the county passing our RTLO. So when anti-lockouts in general were illegal, but the difficult part was low-income renters being able to have their rights protected. What the anti-lockout provision does is it ensures that without notice, a renter can't have the locks on their doors changed. And so what we were seeing were individuals coming to their properties with all their belongings in their apartment or in their home, and the doors and the locks being changed and not being allowed entry. So this ensures that can't no longer happen in suburban Cook County.
Great. Commissioner Britton, talk to me about caps on late fees, security deposits, move-in fees, all of those other costs that aren't strictly rent. We're having audio.
So there have been provisions like this in the Chicago ordinance since the mid-'80s. So Ours are a little different because the chimes have changed and we tweaked them a little bit. But a security deposit, for instance, cannot be more than 1.5 times your monthly rent. Anything more than that is not allowed. Late fees, which are a big issue that I was talked to and Kevin and I discussed with a lot of the advocate groups. I mean, if you can't pay your rent, it's not because you're worried about the late fees. You can't pay your rent because you don't have any money. Late fees can just be an onerous and punitive imposition on renters who are already struggling. And so we wanted to put some caps on those. So it's basically $10 per, if you're under $1,000 in rent. And then if it's over $1,000, it's $10 plus 5% of whatever the amount is over $1,000. So if you're renting a really nice place for $5,000, your security deposit can be quite substantial. But if it's smaller, there are very significant limits on that. And one thing, again, the advocate groups came to us and said was that landlords were using move-in fees in lieu of security deposits because security deposits have rules and regulations about where you can put them in the bank and those kinds of things. So move-in fees are still allowed, but it has to be related in some way to the actual costs of people moving in. You can't just charge them $3,000 because you want to. It has to relate to some reasonable expense that the landlord has to undertake. And those can be estimated. They don't have to be precise, but it has to be something in the real world, not just because you want to charge somebody a bunch of money that you don't have to give back.
Okay. We're talking about move-in fees and living now. What is to Commissioner Morrison, talk to me about what a habitable unit is and how that's defined and what rights you have to a habitable unit. You know, I think it's trying to get around what in civilian parlance might have been kind of called a slumlord back in the day.
Well, thank you for the question. The simplest definition is, you know, the right of a renter or a tenant to have the ability to rent a property that you could actually live in, right? And so some of these link to the actual agreements with their landlord, but these could be their rights to certain essential services such as like heat, running water, hot water, electricity, gas. You know, other habitability means a right to a bed bug free location. It could be being free from mold, from seepage. You know, if you are renting a property and it has not been maintained and all of a sudden after a big storm a hole develops in your wall and you've got running water coming into your location, you know, that should be something that your landlord immediately addresses. And so what this provision does in the RTLO is it ensures that our renters should be able to live in a property that is livable, that someone of any normalcy would find adequate and habitable.
Well, how does it do that? As far as, you know, I mean, you know, something happens, your upstairs neighbor, you know, their tub overflows and rains down on you or what have you. But, you know, how do you kind of enforce that? What's the enforcement mechanism besides just your landlord just not returning your phone calls?
Well, and that's an important part too, right? Like a lot of these provisions include notifying the landlord of the issue, right? And it's on the landlord to be responsive. You know, if you are a landlord, you should be keeping up to date with what's going on with your properties and responsive to your tenants. Now, the most important part of this policy is a lot of these provisions were illegal. However, if you're a low-income individual, if you are a working family, you might not be able to afford the attorney to actually go and have these rights protected. And a lot of times prior to the RTLO, you wouldn't have any of those costs returned if you were able to afford an attorney in the first place. So if your landlord is, as you said earlier, a quote unquote slumlord and not taking care of their properties, not being diligent, not being responsible, allowing for major disrepairs, you know, a lot of times, unfortunately, in suburban Cook County, for 245,000 suburban renters, if you didn't have the means to afford on your own a attorney to have those rights protected, and you were able to survive without having any of those attorney costs returned to you after the court proceedings concluded, incredibly difficult for those renters to have their day in court and have those rights protected. And so this policy does something to help ensure that there's a pathway to make sure that those bad actors are not able to take advantage of our working class renters in suburban Cook County.
And Tom, one other thing that I think is a tremendous benefit in this category is if something's broken and they don't fix it, you can fix it. And you can take that money out of the rent. That's been in the Chicago ordinance since the 80s, but it hasn't existed in suburban Cook County. So if your hot water heater is not getting fixed by your landlord, you can fix it and you can take the money out of your rent. So, I mean, that you don't even have to go through a legal process. You can do it yourself.
It's that just, pay what's left of your rent and a receipt, and then.
Exactly. And you got to obviously document it, but it's in the landlord tenant ordinance.
Okay. One of the questions that kind of begs is we're talking about now a lot more of the responsibilities of the landlords. This was a political process bringing this through the county board, and realtors and landlords are a pretty strong interest group in any level of government. So what was some of the pushback that you saw, and from the realtors, from the real estate community? How was that debated and how was that resolved? I mean, what was in it that got you enough support from landlords, who obviously have influence of their own, no doubt. What got that through to passage for you?
Well, I think Kevin and I could probably fill up.
You have to change,
Yeah, I think Kevin and I could fill up the next 2 or 3 hours with a basic summary of all the conversations we had with the landlords. And I understand they have interests, and there were things in there that they wanted changed. And I think the last count I had was we made about 40 different changes without gutting the basic protections for tenants, which is the reason that I brought this forward, and Kevin did too. I'm not lying. This was not designed to help landlords more than they already helped by being, advantageous and having economic resources that tenants don't have. But I wanted it to be fair. And so we met multiple times and we made a bunch of changes. There are significant differences between the suburban Cook County ordinance and the Chicago ordinance based on those conversations. And I think that they may not want to talk about it, but I think that the landlords understand that there were significant compromises made.
And Tom, if I could add too, like I started receiving phone calls the moment we introduced it, which I gotta say, those organizations are on top of their stuff. Okay, so I think I got like a half dozen phone calls the first day, but I gotta commend Commissioner Britton. He's been an incredible partner to work on the RTLO with. We worked on the vote ordinance with, both of which, we had pushback when those were introduced. And so not so much as we dealt with in the RTLO process, but we took our time to speak with advocates on both sides of the issue. And we really wanted to make sure that we ended up passing a good policy that also met the goals that we had in bringing it forward to begin with. And, the funny thing is there was actually one change that I made during the process that the landlord groups didn't notice and didn't ask for us to change. And that was the fact that we have certain provisions that would not be allowed in leases. And we didn't have any language that allowed any protection for leases that had been entered into before our policy went into effect. And so I actually, without being asked to, added language to ensure that leases that had been entered to prior to our to the date that this went into effect, you cannot use those lines against your tenant, but you also cannot be held liable for having portions of your lease that went against the RTLO.
So the RTLO superseded the language in any lease upon its taken effect on June 1st.
Well, for example, one of the things that we said is you can't have a provision that says, you know, that, you know, your tenant can, you know, maybe Scott could better say the language, but like go to a court or say anything bad about the landlord.
Saying that has
Yeah,
to go to
retaliatory
arbitration.
actions, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, and the arbitration, I'm more familiar with it in the corporate realm, but you know, the sometimes the person who controls the lease controls who the arbitrator is, and obviously that can be problematic. I guess one of the, and I'm going to put this question to both of you. Why was it important to do this in the first place? And I guess what did you, to add to that, were there any things that surprised you, or any things you learned about just this whole, you know, the needs and concerns of renters and landlords and all that maybe surprised you, or just were important takeaways? So yeah, why did you do it, and what did you learn?
So Tom, it started with a conversation I had with some renters in suburban Cook County in Glenview, but unincorporated Glenview. And I had them meet me at the Glenview Library. I thought there'd be 4 or 5 people showed up, and it was 50 people who came into the room. And they were telling me there are these terrible things going on with our landlord, who's a New Jersey corporation, and they're not doing anything. And there was an uncovered pool. There was a lot of problems. And I said, well, we just use the landlord tenant ordinance that exists in suburban Cook County, and we'll take care of that. And then I found out there wasn't one, which I was a little surprised to hear. And so I talked to Kevin about it, and we decided we wanted to do something about it. So that was the genesis of it. And I'll share one quick thing. I was on with the landlords recently, and I brought up the fact that this was a terrible landlord. And they said, well, you know, that landlord actually is out of business. They went bankrupt and they sold the property to somebody else, and the bank took it over. And the landlord said, well, the capitalist system worked. They went out of business. Yeah, they went out of business 5 years after they bought that property. Those people lived for 5 years with a terrible landlord that they had no recourse to. But now, thanks to Kevin and my efforts on this ordinance, they do have a way to make sure that landlord keeps it habitable, just as Kevin described.
Yeah, and for me, one of the things that was most impactful was within the first few months of me taking office, I took part in a point in time count with some of my team, going around portions of my district and identifying locations where the unstably housed were finding places to stay over the evening. And I remember we went through a parking lot, and I had a conversation with an individual who had a full-time job and but was also putting himself through school and was sleeping in his car because he couldn't afford housing. And this is someone with a full-time job, a good job, but to, you know, make ends meet and also pay off his college dues at the same time. It was incredibly difficult for him to even find housing other than his vehicle. And I remember at that time wanting to learn as much as possible in terms of what we could do here at the county to really help that situation and ensure that not only are we addressing the needs of the unstably housed, but making sure that our renters, our tenants are able, you know, to have a voice and have, you know, the ability to for prosperity, to live comfortably, and with throughout that journey and having so many conversations with you know, people working to protect the rights of renters and tenants. Me and Scott both discovered that there was a need for more protections for suburban Cook County renters, and there was a large gap. And I'm really glad that we help see it actually close.
Okay, we actually have a couple of questions on the Zoom chat. So one of them says, are you open to common sense amendments to this ordinance? They didn't
Because
say
it all depends on how common sense they are, Tom. I can tell you that when Kevin and I were in negotiations with the landlord groups, one thing we promised them was that this is not the end of the process, it's the beginning. And if there are things that they're not working, we'll only find out once it's been in place for a while. It's only been 3 weeks for the full RTLO. And so we're happy to listen and happy to make changes that make sense both for the landlords and the renters.
And one thing I want to throw out there too, just on that note, um, we're always happy to provide information to landlords about how to ensure that they're following these policies. And I believe that what we passed, is leaps and bounds better. And I think hopefully we got a lot of the landlord and realtor groups to agree that there were provisions in our policy that were superior than Chicago's. But I had a conversation with my cousin who, back in the day, he worked for Apartment Finders, and he was under the city's RTLO. And he goes, well, it was never an issue for me dealing with, renting out properties and dealing with landlords. Like, it had already, the process had already begun to run smoothly. They knew what their responsibilities were.
I think that, and I've got a few more questions that are coming into the queue, but one of the other things that just leads me to is how are you, I mean, obviously we're doing this tonight, but how are you guys going to educate, I mean, landlords and tenants need to be educated about this ordinance, and how's that outreach effort going to work, and them understanding what the rules are, what the penalties are, what all that?
So we've tried to do a lot of outreach. We've been coordinating with a lot of the advocate groups for tenants to make sure they are aware of it. The Chicago Human Rights Commission will have the ability to weigh in on this and to be able to at least to give you the information if someone needs it. And all these legal aid groups are happy to do it. Again, you can find all that information on the county's webpage. So I've gone to a Chicago Bar Association property law. I think they're most well-attended one they ever had. It wasn't exactly a friendly group with me, but I went there and I explained what was going on. We've reached out to the assessor's office to try to find ways we can get more information out to landlords to make sure they're aware of it. We have dealt with multiple, and I was just on something with all the landlord and realtor groups where they also were participating in further outreach. So they're doing it, the advocate groups are doing it, and the county is doing it as well. Between all of those, I think we're getting the word out pretty good.
And as you learn more, you're going to be open to possible amendments or tweaks here and there as you need it.
Sure.
Another comment from the comments. How will you be addressing the departure of professional landlords resulting from the introduction of this ordinance and the resulting deterioration of aging housing stock? Do you have plans to incentivize landlords somehow?
I will start by saying, our goal was not to disadvantage landlords. The majority of our landlords in this county are responsible, and they're doing a hard and a good job for their tenants. This was simply to make sure that the most at-risk residents in the county who have the unfortunate reality of having landlords that are those bad actors could have their rights protected. And she asks what we're going to do about incentivizing landlords and trying to help. We've got a lot of opportunities, especially with the ARPA funding coming in from the federal government, to really help. And one thing that I want to see is, help the entrepreneur of tomorrow, right? We need to be doing as best of a job as we can, not only to helping our current small businesses, but ensuring that we are also assisting the entrepreneur of tomorrow get off the ground and being able to, create local jobs and localize wealth and grow our local economies. Is there anything you want to add, Scott?
Yeah, and there are a multitude of both county, state, and federal supports for tenants designed to pay people's rent. That would certainly help, I think, the landlords to make sure. I know landlords have mortgages and families and kids put through college. I understand all that. And we have multiple different support mechanisms, under CARES Act, under the things the county has done, and now under ARPA. But Tom, I'm just going to tell you, my experience is that everybody always, it's kind of a sky is falling. If we put this thing in, all these landlords are going to go out of business, or they're going to go take their business elsewhere. And you know what? There's still people renting apartments in Chicago, and they've had this thing forever. And Yeah, every time I've done something in government, somebody said this is the worst case scenario. It never happens because we were very cautious about making sure we did this in a reasoned way that's not going to cause that to happen, and I don't think it will.
Very good. That's about, we had said we were going to go until 6:30, and it's 6:29. Is there any last things you want to wrap up with? Any last thoughts?
You know, since I noticed that we've had a couple of inquiries in the chat about things that are happening, particularly in the suburbs, including one in my district in Palatine. You know, reach out to my office. Let's tell me what the problems are, and we will do everything we can. You know, potentially to change the ordinance if we need to. Also, as Kevin described, to provide additional support to local businesses and particularly smaller landlords who may need help. There are resources we can direct your way, but let's keep the lines of communication open. This was not designed, again, to be punitive. It's just designed to give people some basic rights that all landlords should be given to people anyway. And so let us know if there's something we can do to help, because we're here for that. Great.
Anything from you to end up, Kevin?
Yeah, and my mom, my aunt are both and one of my cousins, they all have properties that they rent out in Chicago, and they never got pushed out of that market, and they're both small time landlords themselves. And one thing that I just want to say out there is, our goal was to make sure that we were giving protections to those tenants out there when it comes to those bad actors. And that is not the majority of our landlords. And I know that a great deal of our landlords are really serving our communities well. And for anyone who has concerns, our offices are going to continue, working with advocates, but also trying to make sure that we're getting the word out there of what those responsibilities that both fall on landlord and tenant are under the RTLO, but also our offices are always open. If you have questions, concerns, comments, reach out to our office at any time. We're always going to listen. We're always going to take the time, and as long as we have the power, we could be helpful.
Great. Once again, we've been joined by Scott Britton, a Cook County Commissioner from Glenview, Kevin Morrison, a Cook County Commissioner from Elk Grove Village. So we've kind of got both ends of the county there on the north end. I've been Tom Robb. I'm a reporter and political editor for the Journal and Topics newspapers, and we publish the Glenview Journal and the Elk Grove Journal, along with a number of other publications. So the video from this will be able to be replayed on Commissioner Britton's Facebook page, on some of our Facebook and social media with the Journal, and I believe Commissioner Morrison's as well. So thanks very much for joining us. We hope we've enlightened the folks out there with good information. And if you have any more questions, you can reach out and get a hold of either commissioner at their offices. If you want to give your best contacts for people to reach out to you, commissioners.
Yeah. So you could just look up my name and you'll find all the phone numbers. I don't know them all by heart, but if you want to send me an email, it's kevin.morrison@cookcountyil.gov.
Mine's very similar, scott.britton@cookcountyil.gov. And I actually pulled out my business card, so I remember my phone number. But so you can also call my downtown office at 312-603-4932.
Very good. Again, thanks both of you for joining us, and I hope we've spread some information and gained some knowledge here. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
See you, Kevin.
Take care. Be well, everyone.